I don't know about you, but it feels like we've been living through the slowest, most grinding, most screeching, most tortuous U-turn, perhaps in political history. Not because there haven't been bigger or more important U-turns. My word, there have been. Think about, for example, John Major U-turning on the poll tax policy, a signature policy of the previous Thatcher Conservative government. Think about the U-turns that we saw, in a way, the sense around tuition fees. Nick Clegg said he would never do something, then he would do it, and on it goes. Winter fuel, by comparison, is a small matter. That's not to say it doesn't matter, and of course to people in and around the pensioner credit threshold, that 200 quid really matters. But in the main, it was a small benefit, hardly a central part of the welfare state, a small benefit that, to be honest, we can't have thought mattered very much collectively, because it had been depreciating in value in real terms. The 200 quid never uprated year after year after year. And yet, it has proved an albatross, a millstone around the government's neck. You wouldn't want an albatross around your neck, of course, but you get what I'm saying. It has proved catastrophic politically, in a way that, to be honest with you, I have struggled to understand, and maybe you can help me out on this over the course of this hour. I have struggled to understand for the reasons that I've set out. Generally speaking, it was something that was favouring, or it was giving money to richer pensioners, for sure. Do we really want to be giving Paul McCartney the winter fuel allowance? Not saying he actually claims for it, but you know what I mean. Do we really want to be in that situation where money is tight, younger people in all sorts of ways, desperately needing help and assistance? So it always seemed to me odd. That said, the government did not roll the pitch for it. It was politically fecklessly handled. It was cack-handed. It came out of nowhere. It came to define the first year of the government. So it was handled badly. But in terms of the substance and the policy, I think it reveals something very important and very damaging about the political culture in this country. And that is that, frankly, it is weighted to and around over 65s in a way it has never been before. I think this debate and what the government has been forced to do has revealed something fundamental about our politics, which is that we are an aged and aging country where the deck is stacked towards those people in our discourse, in our politics, and in policy and what the government does. I'll explain a little bit more about what I mean about that in a minute, because I know many of you will disagree with it and might even really, really dislike it. Options, or mention some of the options that could be available. It's understood, according to the Times this morning, it's understood that one option is to base the new threshold on the average household disposable income. So that's about $37,000 a year. That's income after taxes. Reeves said yesterday she would not set out how she intended to fund the plans yet, as Natasha was saying, which could cost about £700 million until the autumn budget, but did say that her fiscal rules are non-negotiable. Now, I know many of you will have views about the particulars of the policy, and we could talk about that, but I kind of want to talk about something a bit bigger and a bit grander, because I think this whole fiasco says something about the way our politics is wired, really, about certainly the way our media ecosystem works, who it is weighted to, and who it is for. And if I was to be provocative, and, you know, I know you probably are used to a bit of provocation in this slot, so why not? If I were to be provocative, I might say that I think what this reveals, as if we needed any reminding, is that we live in Boomerville. We live in a country of boomers, by boomers, for the boomers. And what I mean by that is that if we are in a world, honestly, where a government's credibility can be so undermined, so damaged, and don't get me wrong, as I say, they handled it badly, it came out of nowhere, they did no pitch rolling for it, they didn't have a media strategy for it, they weren't really announcing anything else significant at the time, so the media space got filled with it. It was a textbook example of how not to do something that could be controversial. But leaving that to one side and just looking at the principles involved, if we are in a place, in a country, if our debate is so frenzied that we believe that a government must be basically wanting to kind of, it's completely uncaring in any kind of way, its credibility can be so undermined by taking away £200 worth of winter fuel benefit for potentially very rich people, and our country can't quite take it. I think we're in a very, very odd place, because what it shows is that the political power of older people, and in particular, to be honest, older rich people, is so strong, is so vast, is so immense, that the entire British political debate is simply out of kilter for where it should be. And what I mean by that, and to illustrate what I mean, is that we can have this absolute frenzy over £200. And don't get me wrong, like I said, my nan's on pensioner credit, right? She would continue to receive this. There are lots of poorer pensioners out there. Don't want to undermine that for a moment. But when we're talking about, household disposable income of even going towards 40,000, that's a good amount of disposable income to have, right? But depending on where you live in the country. And let alone the pensioners who are doing much better than that. And if we are in a position where that is so controversial that the government has to back down over a benefit that we weren't even uprating, no one cared enough, no one thought it was valuable enough to even keep up with inflation, then it shows the power of this group versus all of the others. And frankly, what government ever again is going to touch any pensioner-related benefit? Because they've just seen what has happened to this one. And bear in mind too, let's just have some facts here. As of March, people who are over 65 in this country own approximately £3 trillion of property wealth, with over 10 million of them owning their own homes without a mortgage. That single demographic, people who are over 65, hold over 43% of the UK's housing wealth. Some of those people are going to get this 200 quid. Some of you who are out there now, who are 18 and 19 and 20 and 21, maybe earning 20,000 a year, and some of you who may have left university who are paying a marginal income tax rate of north of 45%, maybe even higher, you're paying for those people who have that household wealth to get 200 quid a year to help pay for their heating bills. That's crazy. That's just crazy. That's mad. But what's more mad about it, not even just the policy, it's mad that it has been framed and talked about, this policy, as if somehow this country is geared against older people. Sometimes, you heard it in Natasha's package there, sometimes we talk about pensioners as if, you say we owe them a great debt and so on. Of course, to some of them we do. But we're not talking, I think we've got a real hang-up in this country about the war. Most of the people who fought in the war and lived through the war are no longer with us. The greatest generation, they undoubtedly were. But if you're becoming a pensioner this year, you'd have been born in 1959. You're too young for the Beatles. You're too young for the Korean War, let alone the Second World War. You're basically too young for Vietnam. So this sort of psychological debilitation we've got about thinking that pensioners are a particular and special group versus everybody else, I think is deeply, deeply problematic, especially when you consider the plight of the young in this country today. And I'm not talking about even myself, I'm talking about young, I'm 35, I'm talking about younger people. The COVID generation. Remember, it was estimated that it would cost 15 billion quid to allow them to catch up with the education they needed, they lost because of COVID and because of lockdowns. That is something we imposed on them. They had no choice whatsoever, and it's something that they're going to suffer with and have to live through the consequences through potentially into the next century, long after many of us are older. Certainly any of the people who are in receipt of this particular benefit will have long left us. Do we care about them? Do we care? Where is the outrage? Where is the outrage over the fact that we've created a generation who are forced to live in permanent adolescence because they'll never be able to afford a home and their real wages are where they would have been 20 years ago? Where is the outrage? Where is the outrage of the fact that if you are trying to go to university in this country, you are being left with a debt that you basically cannot eliminate of around 50 to 60 to 70,000 a year? The interest rate is so stacked against you, you'll never be able to pay it off. You've basically got an extra marginal income tax rate for 30 years of your life. Where's the outrage? Imagine if that received the sort of outrage that the pensioner, the winter fuel pensioner allowance has received. Imagine if the newspapers were full of that day after day after day, but they're not, and they never will be, because who are those newspapers owned by? They're owned by richer, older people. And so on and on it goes. And I'm not saying that pensioners do not deserve help. My word, they do, in lots of respects. As I say, my own grandmother's on pensioner credit. I know that older people can really, really struggle, and they often suffer. There are a lot of people out there, older people, in private rented accommodation, again, difficult, and they can't do much to expand their income. So this is not an attack on them. What it is an attack on is a political and media culture which seems to focus to the exclusion of all else on one particular group, and one particular group that, to be honest, in the grand scheme of things, in the great suffering there's been over the last 15 years, have been relatively well insulated. Look at if you're a family trying to bring up kids, how tough that is today, the childcare situation in this country. And the thing is, my fear is this is going to get worse and worse and worse, because the older we become as a country, and we are aging, it's one of the great political stories of our time, we are becoming greyer and greyer and greyer. And our country, our media, our culture, our economy, our politics is being directed and weighted more and more year after year. And I would, in that direction, and I would say it is the responsibility of older people. We talk constantly about the responsibility of the young to the old. I think there is a responsibility to the young as well, to ensure that they enjoy the sorts of things and privileges and the sort of country that they grow up in. And in so many ways, that no longer exists. A country of real increasing wages every single year, a house and an ability to rent which isn't crippling you. If you're young in one of the big cities today, you'll be lucky to rent a room, say, in London for much less than £1,000 a month. Probably about 50% of your post-tax income. How on earth are you supposed to save for anything or get a house deposit or whatever it happens to be? But there is no outrage about any of this stuff. There's no outrage in nearly the same way, because it's just expected that they should just get on with it somehow. And yet here we are on winter fuel, as I say, a relatively insignificant benefit in the grand scheme of things, and it has caused the most almighty pain. And I don't think any government, the net result of it is any government ever again is going to touch any of this stuff, which is going to make this policy and this problem even worse. I want to talk to you about what you think about all of this and whether you agree with me that this whole fiasco shows that old people, frankly, are too powerful in this country. Turn. What does that tell us about the political culture of our country? And my view is that it tells us that our political discourse, our political debate is overwhelmingly geared towards older, rich people. And both of those things are important, and I don't want to undermine the last bit of it. But we are in a situation where by common consent and common acknowledgement, it has never been harder. Well, I say common. Not everyone agrees with this, and it's usually people who phone into stations like this and start wanging on about avocado toast. But believe me, it has almost never, certainly since the war, it's basically never been harder to be a young person in so many different ways, whether it's the advance of tech and what that is doing to young people's brains, housing, job security, income, real incomes, university fees, you name it. It has never been harder to get on in life and just do the ordinary things that you need and previous generations would have been expected to do. Get a decent job, get a decent home, have a family. It's never been harder. People don't like to hear that, but it is true. Let me just give you one set of statistics to illustrate that. And again, older people sometimes don't like hearing this, but it's true. In 1960, and this is in real terms, in 1960, the average house price was £2,263. The average income was £1,000. So that meant that there was a price to income ratio of 2.3. Obviously relatively easy. I mean, it's harder to get a mortgage in some ways then, but nonetheless, you've got a price to income ratio of 2.3. 10 years later, in 1970, average house price was £4,500. Average income was £1,600. Price to income ratio 2.8. Nudged up a little bit, not much. 1980, average house price £23,000. Average income £6,000. Price to income ratio 3.9. 1990, average house price £57,000. Average income £13,000. Price to income ratio 4.4. 2000, the price to income ratio had gone down actually to 4 times. So you have 4 times your income in order to buy a house, or versus the average house price. 2010, the average house price is £165,000. Average income is £26,000. Price to income ratio 6.4. And in 2024, the average house price is nearly £300,000. The average income is £35,000. So that means that by 2024, the price to income ratio of house price versus average income is 7.9. 7.9. So the average home now is 8 times the value of the average income. You compare that to 1960, it's 2.3 times. As I say, 1970, 2.8 times, 1980, 3.9 times. So with regards to housing, don't let anybody tell you, they can go on about interest rates as much as they like. Don't let anybody tell you that it is not harder than ever for young people to get on the property ladder. And it's harder than ever for a couple of other reasons as well, which is that in terms of, if you go back to 1960, 1970, 1980, there were way more social homes. They stopped being built. They no longer exist. Indeed, many of them were bought up by people who are now enjoying very, very healthy retirements on buy-to-let and renting them out to young people. You've got generations of young people basically paying for the cruises of extremely wealthy buy-to-let landlords with a finite housing resource. And then on top of that, many local planning committees are dominated by older people, older councillors, who, as I say, want to protect every single hedgerow they come across, even if they're in scragland and pretty unattractive fields, and not build any houses for younger people to live in. So you're compounded, and you're damned, and you're damned, and you're damned again. And I think another way of illustrating what I'm talking about, go back to Theresa May's time. Go back to Theresa May's time. Why did she lose the 2017 election? Or she lost her majority in 2017. Why? Well, it was her social care policy. Whisper it. It was a very sensible policy. It was a very sensible policy that actually would have promoted intergenerational fairness. Because instead of younger generations picking up the very expensive bill for social care, it would have forced older people with substantial property wealth to use some of that wealth when they died to pay for their care. In fact, it wouldn't have been the person who died who was paying for it. It would have been, let's be honest, the often baby boomer who were already probably have substantial wealth of their own, it's their inheritance that would have paid for it. But that's what created uproar. It created outrage. No, says the press. No, we can't possibly have my mother and father's inheritance. It's like some of it being used to pay for their care. That's mine. Let's get younger people to pay for it in their taxes instead. That's the political culture we have. Remember what Theresa May proposed? She proposed that individuals would be required to pay for their own social care if they had assets exceeding £100,000. For the first time, the value of an individual's home would have been considered when assessing their ability to pay for care received at a home, not just for residential care. To prevent individuals from having to sell their homes during their lifetime, the costs of care would be deferred and recovered from their estate after their birth. It was a very sensible policy to recognise the problems of an ageing population. But in a deeply insensible media culture, which is, as I say, weighted towards a particular type of wealthy baby boomer, who just so happen to be the sort of people who own those newspapers, it basically collapsed. It went crazy. It put that whole general election campaign into a frenzy, and May lost her majority over it. So why would any government touch any assets that older rich people have when they get stung, when it's a third rail? And I do not think that is a healthy situation to be in. One criticism I'd make of younger people, though, is that, I said I wanted to talk a little bit about how we could try and address this. Well, one very easy way to address it, of course, would be if young people did what, in fairness, older people do, partly to protect their interests, but partly because it's their civic obligation and good for them, is vote more. If younger people voted more and exercised their democratic rights, then perhaps we would have a re-geared political culture in this country. We would have a more equitable political culture, but they don't. So something I would do, potentially, is what the Australians do. You have compulsory voting. You have compulsory voting, and it forces young people into the democratic process in a way that they currently decide to abscond from it. And to be honest, I think one of the reasons they decide to abscond it is that old political aphorism, which is if voting changed anything, they'd abolish it. I don't believe that, but I think that is what many young people do believe, because everything feels so weighted against them.